Where'd you get all those medals? Captain, the voice close behind me dripped with sarcasm. You buy them in the PX? I turned around only to be confronted by two MPS with big grins and hard eyes. They looked strangely out of place in the St. Francis Hotel bar. Looks to me like you're impersonating an officer boy, said the other one, putting his hand on my elbow and easing me to my feet. I think we should step outside. He'd gotten my number all right, as far as I was concerned. I'd been impersonating an officer and I was commissioned, but I didn't like the way he said it, and I didn't like that arrogant son of a gun touching me. I'd just gotten home assigned to Fort Mason for processing. I'd spent the last couple of days wandering around San Francisco, the other end of the earth, it seemed. From the trenches of Korea, trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. It was the toughest decision I'd ever faced, and I only had 3 days to make up my mind. The only two options, according to the personnel officer at Mason, were to sign up for another 3 years as a reserve officer, or to get out of the army. It shouldn't have been so hard. General Cleland had pretty well convinced me to get out and go to school. But I'd rotated home with Roy Hurt, that G-223D West Point stud of a platoon leader whose father was a colonel, and he'd spent the whole damn boat ride persuading me to stay in now, as the MPS led me out of the bar. All I knew for certain was that a purple rage was washing over me. I was embarrassed the other patrons who hadn't even glanced in my direction when I'd arrived, let alone come over to slap me on the back or say job well done, were now gawking, and I could see on their faces their collective disdain for just another army guy in trouble, so much for the glory of being a soldier. I thought as the MPS hassled me now in the hotel lobby for identification I didn't have. I finally convinced them to call Fort Mason, and as one of them marched off to the phone booth, the other stayed and kept an eye on me. In the meantime, I thought about the army to keep myself from punching out my smart-ass captor. There was no question but that it was my life, or at least it had been for 7 years now. I'd been a private, I'd been a non-com. I jumped into Korea eyes wide open, and suddenly I was an officer, a little leap that had cost me on paper anyway. 3 more years' service I'd gone back to Korea, not just because I couldn't handle the idea of stateside duty, but because of the sergeant combat complex that had fueled me since Trieste. I'd been determined to get as much combat experience as possible so that no one could ever put me down again for not being the most qualified at my job. It seemed to me that was a career choice in itself, but now the war was almost over, and combat qualifications would have nothing to do with anything. Reserve officers would be getting the AXS en masse, according to General Cleland, and even if I signed up, there was no guarantee that I wouldn't be chopped within months. It seems so unfair, particularly since I still had almost a year to go on my 3-year wartime off-officer's contract. But I guessed it had always been that way. The reserve men were called in to do the platoon and company-level dirty work, while so many regulars hid under staff duty rocks. When the shooting was over, the regulars pranced out into the sunlight and ruthlessly ground the fighters into the dirt. I saw the MP who'd called Fort Mason striding across the hotel foyer, a sheepish look on his face. Guess someone had told him I was indeed Boy Captain Hackworth, and that the medals were well earned and all mine. Sorry about that, Captain. He said, "Gee, Captain," the other jumped in, no hard feelings. For a moment, I just looked at the 2 polished MP pricks snivelling in front of me. For some reason they said it all, whatever it was. And in that instant I made up my mind, just get screwed. I said, "I'm getting out of your army anyway." I was off active service for 2 years, the 2 longest of my life. I never know whether I made the right decision in quitting over the MPS. One thing I was sure of, though, was that I regretted it from the moment I left Fort Mason. Civilian life was boring. It just wasn't my bag. From the outset, I missed the adventure, the kinship, and the sense of belonging that came with being in the army. I probably missed the structured, disciplined life too. I couldn't find a purpose in the world outside the military, and the same unknown variable that had compelled me from childhood to join up now had me counting the days until my self-imposed exile was over. General Cleland had been assigned the top soldier job in the army as CGS-8 Airborne Corp. We corresponded frequently. He urged me not only to hit the books, but to remain active in the reserves, so I wouldn't lose touch accordingly. I joined, or more precisely rejoined, the 40th Division, which was transferred back to California and National Guard, in Eptitude when the Korean War ended 6 weeks after I came home. It didn't take long for me to realize why the 40th had been so screwed up when it first deployed to Korea. There was nothing military about this NG organization, except that we wore uniforms when we met once a week to drink coffee and shoot the breeze each summer. We had a 2E training period at Camp Roberts, but by the time we'd unpacked and got set to play war, it was just about time to go home without General Cleland to fuel the flame. The light of the fireball had flickered and died for myself. I started out as an enthusiastic Troop SE in the Division Recon Squadron, but when I found I was one of the few guys on the block who even gave a damn, I decided not to make waves. Instead, I rocked along with the rest of the weekend warriors and refused to feel guilty over the absolute waste of taxpayer dollars I was at loose ends. It was a post-combat hangover for which no hair of the dog cure existed, made all the worse by newspaper and magazine coverage of the unsatisfying conclusion of the war. The Time magazine wrap-up, for example, which contained an excerpt from a wartime interview with General Van Fleet. "Damn near killed me, Reporter General. What is our goal, Van Fleet?" "I don't know. The answer must come from higher authority, reporter. How may we know, General, when and if we achieve victory, Van Fleet?" "I don't know, except that somebody higher up will have to tell us what I asked myself is a war without a goal. What was victory, if not something you could taste and breathe and feel? Instead, there'd just been 3 years of fighting for nothing, $22 billion spent, and no decisive victory, more than 33,600 American lives lost, 103,000 men wounded in action, 13,000 men captured, or MIA. And that was not to mention the civilian military casualties of almost 244,000 and the 3.7 million left homeless in South Korea alone. It was such a horrible waste, and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles' War's End proclamation, that for the first time in history an international organization has stood against an aggressor, did little to justify it. At least, in my eyes, we hadn't lost, but we hadn't won even worse. We meaning not the guys on the ground, but the UN governments led by the United States hadn't even tried. At least after the first year, it was something I didn't think I'd ever understand. I settled in Santa Monica, dutifully enrolled in Santa Monica City College, and began to educate myself. It meant nothing to me. I just managed to scrape by. I felt bitter hurt, betrayed. Most of my energy was spent drinking, fighting, and chasing girls, till finally I reached the point where I gave up the first for about a year to stop the second. But that's where I drew the line right down the road in Ocean Park, died in 1954. I was surprised at how deeply it affected me. She'd been a bigoted, opinionated old lady. So many of the 1860s values she'd stamped into my impressionable child's mind had been proved inaccurate in the years since I'd left home, that I thought I'd dismissed little pieces of Graham herself as each of her truths bit the dust. But I hadn't. She was as much a part of me as I was of her. And at 23, I realized that that was never going to change. Graham was a brave frontier lady whose family had traveled overland from Virginia to Kentucky to the rich mining country of Colorado, with the dream of carving out a new life. Many times she told me about that life, how she'd hidden in her prairie house as Indians on the warpath stalked around outside, how her father John Stedman would load up his rifle and shoot men to protect his kids. In her 19th century way, Graham had had the same lust for adventure as the men of the Hackworth clan she married into, and though it was Uncle Roy who spun tales of the war to end all wars, it was Graham who drummed into me the litany of Hackworth military feats throughout America's history, inaccurate as most of her accounts proved to be. The constant commercial for duty, honor, and country instilled in me a fierce patriotism which guided me every day of my life. Thanks to her, I grew up believing that anything that stood in the way of progress of manifest destiny and what was rightfully ours after the funeral. 2 of Graham's children raided her little house in Ocean Park years before, prior to his disappearing down a creek. Minshaft never to be seen again. John Hackworth, Graham's husband, had been a successful gold miner and mining superintendent. Now their kids, who still lived in Colorado, were convinced my grandmother had a stash of gold stock certificates concealed under her bed, having suffered the indignity of receiving relief packages on our doorstep all through my depression childhood, powdered milk, instant margarine, and all kinds of other stuff, including clothes and cardboard shoes for me that you could tell at 100 paces had been issued by the state. I could have told them that if Graham had anything, it was the money I'd sent her every month since I joined the Merchant Marine, but they didn't ask, and when I walked into the house, they were literally ripping it apart. My Aunt Frida was wearing a gold watch I'd bought for Graham in Italy. I tore it off her arm and told everyone to get the hell out that I'd just come back from killing a lot of people, and I was perfectly prepared to kill them too. In his way, big tough David Hackworth was still the same little kid who'd clung to Graham's legs as she stood by the door holding a suitcase and threatening to leave if I didn't shape up. The trick had worked for a few years, until the time the suitcase popped open and I found out it was empty. Now as then, having lost my army family, I was a brand new orphan with nothing to fall back on. One thing I was, though, was a survivor. I transferred to Woodbury College after a year at SMCC, majored in salesmanship, and became a part-time insurance man for Prudential. Both Jack Speed and Uno Rentmeister came out to visit for a while, and to get to know some of my female clients, while they weighed and dined, I just kept on selling, and in 3 months I'd sold enough insurance to qualify for the $1955 million round table. I had to admit there was great satisfaction in finding out I wouldn't be a complete bust in civilian life. But I was still counting those days because I had no intention of being a civilian even 1 minute longer than necessary. Besides, I was finding out that civilian life could be damn dangerous, according to Jack Speed. Some of my beloved raiders had pulled off a final stateside raid long after the unit broke up with the help of a submachine gun one of them had managed to smuggle back from the battlefield. Apparently, when these 3 raiders were not appropriately welcomed in San Francisco, they decided to announce their return by raiding a downtown bank in broad daylight. The submachine gun prevented heroics on the part of the bank staff, but the guys got caught a short time later and were now serving 20 to 30 years in a California federal penitentiary in mid-55. I wrote General Cand to tell him I'd almost finished those magic 2 years of college and had submitted my application for active duty. I told him I'd requested assignment to the 82D Airborne at Fort Bragg. Within days, a paratrooper friend of Cleveland at the Department of the Army's Office of Personnel Operations OPO called and tried to persuade me not to go there. He said the airborne was finished, Army aviation, and choppers were the new wave, and there was an in-crowd club feel at Bliss, which was emulated throughout the whole air defense arm. And it didn't matter that the Army had come to realize a guy could get pretty lazy sitting by his gun, waiting for an enemy who never came, and had begun infusing super gung-ho infantry and field artillery people into the program. The guys in charge at Brigade Region and Army Air Defense Commander ADCOM were still mainly World War II air defense men who'd spent their lives in step with the Air Corps in that organization's minimum military ways. It didn't make for changes, and again I was struck not only by the overall sloppiness, but by the utter lack of urgency among permanent party personnel. It was an Air Force attitude, unshakable confidence that we're here to stay, and they were despite the fact that Ebedale would be phasing out all its active duty gun units by the end of 1956 and replacing them with missiles. The new Nike Ajax units to most were more of the same, even if somewhat more complex once their training was completed. These ad guys would go right back to staring at the sky. The only difference would be they'd be part of a new club, the Nike Battalion package, which included all key people from the CO to the lowest radar technician. For someone like me, with absolutely no background in AAA bliss, was more often than not a nightmare. The anti-aircraft battery officers course was so hard that I would have given up my infantry colonel standard of living and dug a foxhole every night if it would have helped unlock the mysteries of electricity, overcurrent tree resistance horizontal slant ranges, or superheroines still in direct contrast to what I'd known at Benning. The quality of instruction at Bliss was of the highest caliber. The dawning missile age had no precedent in history. The Army could no longer depend on its pink-cheek virgin lieutenants to parrot after-action reports of World War II or even Korea to teach us how to fight tomorrow's wars. Granted, many of our instructors at Bliss were young lieutenants, some were even drafty PFCs, Most had no combat experience either, but they did have PhDs from MIT or similar institutions. These whiz kids knew their stuff and taught it in a non-nonsense professional way. Their ability was enough to make dumbasses like me want to cry. I was worried sick about flunking out and blowing my army career. Just when it was starting, I made good friends with a couple guys who were in much the same boat. Tom Trainer, a World War II battlefield commission. Now a fire chief in Chicago, and Bob Streiner, a private eye in Palo Alto, were both members of NG units that had been converted from infantry to EBLA and recalled in response to the Red Scare. The three of us lent each other moral support and spent many an evening drowning our sorrows across the border in Jude's, Mexico, for more concrete assistance in passing the dam course. I turned to two Marine Corps officers, Lieutenant Casey and Captain Everett, both long-time admen stationed at Thousand Palms, California. We'd met through a shared passion for physical fitness. I was a fanatic about running and push-ups at this time, and because that was pretty unusual among our classmates, I guess it impressed the two gung-ho Marines who made no bones about their feeling that the Army was a pretty Mickey Mouse organization. Marines being Marines, they no doubt didn't believe me when I told them Fort Bliss was not really the Army, but I was desperate enough for their assistance not to stand in the door over it. In the end, I graduated 32 out of 36 in the course, but just as the guy who comes in last in medical school is still called doctor. I was still record and Moss-wise considered a fully qualified anti-aircraft battery officer. I took comfort in knowing that as a commander I wouldn't have to remember the details I'd held in my brain long enough to pass the tests. I just have to make sure I got some smart guys on my team to do that kind of thinking for me. Battery C of the 77th LA was smack dab in the middle of Manhattan Beach, California, so much for the great adventures I dreamed of upon recall to active duty. My new Army home was half a block from my favorite beach across the street from Poncho's, one of my favorite haunts over the last 2 years. And 10 minutes from where I was born, the post didn't have a Bok, the departing Battery XO, a University of San Francisco basketball star named Jim Ruin, was checking out of the service and took over his bachelor pad on the beach. All in all, it seemed as if the only notable difference in my lifestyle was going to be wearing my soldier suit every day instead of just weekends. And thanks to Jim, a whole new list of Southern California beauties to look up in my off-hours C battery was one of 4 identical firing batteries in the 77th. It was composed of 4 AA guns and 2 radar acquisition and tracking sections. Soldiers manned the guns, but in fact the system pretty well ran itself. The acquisition radar was designed to pick up a target as far out as 100 miles and transfer it to the tracking radar. Once it got into range, the tracking radar would then send out an identification friend or foe IFF signal. If no response was received, the aircraft would be considered hostile, and we, the human element, would prepare to fire the gun. Crew's tasks were simply to set the shells with an automatic fuse setter and load the guns the tracking radar locked onto the target, and did the rest. It all sounded good, but over the next 9 months we came close to blowing friendly aircraft out of the sky. On a number of occasions there was much room for error in the system, if only because of the incredible amount of ordinary air traffic in and out of LA. Luckily, jet fighters dispatched by the Anti-Aircraft Operations Center AAOC to intercept, identify and or shoot down the presumed hostile always saved the day, finding that the IFFF equipment on board was malfunctioning or that the target was a friendly civilian aircraft that had simply lost its way. I inherited C battery from Lieutenant David Kramer, who stayed on as my EXO. Kramer was a good officer with about 8 years' service and a lot of experience in airborne field artillery. He'd run a damn good AD-OUT, a fact that in its way made both of our new jobs harder. No one likes to see someone come in and mess with his perfect unit, especially if that someone was as undiplomatic as I, and when I decided to shake the natural sit-on-your-ass mentality out of C battery with hard training, tough inspections, and an immediate halt to those 9 to 5 days exco, Kramer had no choice but to back me up initially, and naturally my men hated me most. Were Dre's a number, were regular lazy-ass ADNC, all of them reminded me of the National Guardsmen in, and I pushed them just as hard as I had the Heavy Weapons Company, Boys, from the moment they stood at 600, the only people who hated me more were the army wives who'd gotten pretty comfortable with their husbands, 16 hours at home, non-S soldiering soldiers' lives, the local community, which had to bear our singing and counting as we ran down the beach every morning, and my battalion co-lieutenant Colonel George L., the weak, unsure ex-lawyer commander who knew precious little about soldiering and nothing at all about leadership, swayed by the belly aching of some of those shrewd career NCOs who'd figured ad was a good way to mark time. Until I'd come in and upset their sunny California vacation, Thyssen was constantly after me to cut out the training. Air defenders said he did not have to be paratroopers. My stock answer was that the 6th Radcom CG Major General E.M. Cow had put out a training memo calling for an hour's PT every morning, and I was just following orders, sir. In truth, I knew the sort of training I was putting these men through was unnecessary in ad. The odds of their needing the stamina or the infantry-like skills I insisted upon were slim to none, but at the same time these were line soldiers. There was no excuse for their not being kept physically tough and ready to go, regardless of the cushy jobs they had going. At the moment, my concern was not without precedent. During the Battle of the Bulge, in December of '44, the US command flat ran out of infantrymen, and because there was no Nazi air threat people were sent to fight in infantry units. The same happened in Korea, who was to say it could not happen again. So just like the proverbial new broom, I kept up the training, and the boys learned pretty quickly that the good old days were over, and a new man was sweeping the floor. As a result, a leader sometimes finds himself in a situation of having to hide his more human side one morning in the early days. For example, I had a time running on the beach, terrible stomach pains. So it took every bit of willpower I possessed to keep going, but I couldn't fall out, not ever, let alone with the eyes of 100 unwilling air defenders boring in on me. Somehow I made it back to the battery. The doc there took one look, called for an ambulance, and before I even had a chance to protest in the words of good Sergeant Prena, that only the lame, the lazy, and the screw-offs go on sick call. I was on an operating table at Fort MacArthur having my near-bursting appendix removed. I'd never know what kind of celebration arose out of my untimely leave from Sea Battery, but I'm sure that was all for the best. It was the first time I'd hit seek call in almost 10 years of service when ID first arrived at the battery. The World War II vintage prefab facilities on post were falling apart as quickly as they'd been thrown up in the face of the imminent Red attack. The barracks were open squad rooms with no privacy. It wasn't all that easy to distinguish between the mess and the latrine. Unquestionably, something had to be done, and it was number one on my list. The second I got out of the hospital, Sir, work orders went in. Fort MacArthur just doesn't have any money, explained Master Sergeant Allison. My supply, Sergeant Allison, was a fine old soldier. He probably had 30 years' service by then, starting out long ago as a Buffalo soldier with the illustrious Black Cavalry Regiment. And I love the guy. He drank his share of booze every day, gulping it right down a water glass at a time, and still ran the straightest supply room I'd ever seen. Well, Sergeant work orders won't get this place fixed up. What do you think we should do? Not since the 30s, when the army was so broke that General George C. Marshall at Benning had had to mow his own lawn, had units, had such a hard time making ends meet. The problem was that for the first time in a long, long time, the man in the White House knew what was happening at Fort Hooker or Camp Breen Ridge. When the budgets hit Ike's desk, he could take one look and know that the money being requested for a radar testing station would actually be used to build a golf course or a snazzy officer club. Eisenhower had definite ideas as to what was needed and what was not, and with a confident stroke of a pen, he acted anything that didn't fit in with his overall military austerity program. In the meantime, the troops lived in Hewells and said shoelaces to hold their morale up. The president was a far cry from the Ike I'd met during an inspection of my recon company nearly 10 years before in Cormans, Italy, then as Supreme Commander of all Allied forces. He'd asked me whether I was being fed well. I'd said no, and he'd been surprised. He'd immediately called over the Mediterranean Theatre Commander General Lee. He'd said to the 3-star relation of Civil War fighter Robert E. Lee, "There's a boy here who's not getting enough to eat." "No, sir," I'd interrupted, "I'm getting enough. It's just that it's always the same thing. I've been in this battalion for 3 months, and all we've had for breakfast, lunch and dinner is dehydrated, scrambled eggs and spam. Is that true? Ike asked General Leo. We've had a big surplus of spam, General, and we've been trying to use it up. Well, let me check on that a little further. Ike, before I knew it, there had been a hushed conference of Ike's general staff right in front of me. Finally, Ike had turned to me again and flashed his famous grin. Don't worry about it, son, we'll fix this up right away. And he did, because surplus or no surplus, we never had spam again. In 1956, a lot of units were just wearing the poverty line conditions being imposed by the new Ike, but just like that. Little kid in Italy who gotten fed up with spam, I wasn't going to, and I didn't expect C Battery to do so either. So Master Sergeant Allison started to wheel and deal for building material. The hardest thing to come by was Timber SFC Normal Crot, an ex-Marine, and damn good soldier himself solved this problem when he let on he knew of a big stack of pine 2x4s, just screaming to be liberated from a civilian construction site down the road for the next month. We made frequent midnight hits on the site and a number of others in the area. It wasn't exactly lawful activity, but it was good combat training for the men of my new command who proudly started calling themselves Hackworth's Rangers. In the meantime, Gun Sergeant Charles Landry, who'd been a concrete man in civilian life, arranged to get us the excess a local concrete guy was dumping at the end of each day. The merchant got a tax break, and we got concrete walks and driveways, as well as permanent maintenance-free revetments to replace the eroding sandbags around the guns. When we got enough wood, we rebuilt the barracks to provide individual rooms. We renovated the latrine too, and by the time PFC Richard Plumer got through tiling it with seconds from a local factory, it was in all our opinions the Mona Lisa of crap houses. Finally, we rebuilt and redecorated the mess to look like a fancy seafood restaurant, complete with fishnets draped all over the place, and the battery was something the men could be comfortable in and proud of. The building program had given Theme a break from the monotonous waiting game they'd become locked into, and combined with the training, which improved both individual and team proficiency. Now the guy's drag-ass defensive attitude was being replaced with a keen offensive spirit, anything C Battery could be. The best at it was best. Supply, best motor pool, best mess the latter, under the watchful eye of ME's Sergeant SFC George Clark, a graduate of Tuskegee Institute with a BS in food administration, who could create gourmet feasts out of any Army-issue rations. We won the 47th Brigade Championship in softball and basketball, CE to the market on Brigade Soldier of the Month selection, and in the 47th annual inspection out of 30 batteries. Ours was number 1. The irony of it all was that despite our successes, I personally remained number 1 in both Battalion SE Othyson and the Manhattan Beach Community's bad books. The concept of small posts being located in residential areas was somewhat new to the Army. It was one I was convinced the Manhattan Beach homeowners were none too pleased with, though a lot of organisations came on to our renovated post for tours and went home suitably impressed. The next day I'd still get a phone call from some S-optimist or another, complaining that our morning run or battery alert siren was annoying the seagulls, when I'd explained to the caller that it was just tough. She'd ring the colonel. Colonel Thien, meanwhile, didn't even talk to me anymore. Instead, he sent reports and warning messages through his S3 or XO or through old Milo Raoul, the hearts-losing millionaire Ebola officer who'd collocated with me. And easy once upon a time in my Wolfhound days in Korea, Milo, now a captain, was assigned as the 77th Battalion Adjutant S1. He crashed at my place until he found one of his own, and kept me AB breast of what the colonel was thinking. The word was never good. I demanded too much. I pushed too hard. I was insensitive to the representatives of the Seagulls, right to Nest Foundation. He was considering relieving me. The litany went on, and I was sick because I wanted the colonel to like me, and I wanted him to appreciate my unit. After all, it wasn't as though C Battery was some sad sack organisation. We were damn good, and I truly believe the reason for it was the deeply ingrained trust standards of proficiency Dedican, and a spree I'd brought to the outfit. But if I'd learned soldiering in a Trieste to time warp, if trust was a throwback whose standards had long since died, then it was just tough Colonel Thon, and so be it. I couldn't have changed my ways, even if I'd tried. To square the different serial numbers, no easy chore in itself, as it required probably 10 different typewriters and pens, as well as a master forger's touch to age the paper. And finally, only one step remained to turn the weapon into ordnance, get credit for the turn-in and remove the number from the books once and for all. I'd stayed out of the whole operation the minute Clark and Allison, those two fine old army men, got into the ACT. I took the carbine off my worry list completely. So when Allison dropped by my office the day before payday, at first, I didn't understand the mysterious poker face he was wearing. Would the captain have $50? He asked. What for, Sergeant? Well, Captain, I'm aiming to finish off the little project George and I have been working on. The light went on. You got it, Allison. I said, what have you got in mind? I'm thinking I'll just mosey on down to Ordnance. I got a buddy over there who'd be mighty happy celebrating my win at the races. Sir Allison's plan was simple and absolutely brilliant. Traditionally, the day before the Eagle Crap was one when most old regular sergeants were broke and very thirsty. The supply sergeant knew his ordnance pal was no exception. So with my $50 he took his friend out on the town that night, late in the evening, when the ordnance man was sufficiently mellow, knee-knocking drunk. In fact, Allison mentioned he wanted to do a weapons turn-in the morning, first thing he said, so he didn't have to waste a minute of his day off. No problem slurred his friend, still feeling no pain from the night before. The next morning Allison took the weapon over to Ordnance. By then the M2 had been further modified to include a bent, no longer serviceable barrel. Within moments the twisted rifle was on the junk heap, and a receipt had been written out. My career was saved, and Allison and his hungover buddy were off to wet their furry tongues again for a long time. I worried where that carbine would surface, whether I'd open up the paper one morning to find a bank full of people had been gunned down on full automatic, because despite all else, I took my job in sleepy Manhattan Beach very seriously. After almost 10 years in the Army, it was my first stateside command, the first time I'd actually been tasked with the defense of the nation. Italy and Korea were both so far from home that the connection between their defense and America seemed thinner than the slack in a hair trigger. In truth, I was not as caught up as the administration and the general populace seemed to be in the fear that the Soviets were coming any second, but there was no doubt in my military mind that the communists were the enemy, and my job entailed being on alert and always ready to fight them on the beaches in the streets, any time and any place, and beat them at all costs. Sometimes, though it was very hard to stay enthusiastic in my neighbourhood, at least David Kramer had been transferred out of the battalion by now. He'd joined the Army's 1st Nuclear-Equipped Division, the low-yield Honest John, packing 1 or 1st Airborne. C Battery continued to move from success to success. I'd weeded out most of the troublesome old air defenders in the main. The team ran itself now. From then on, my goal in any of my commands, with senior NCOs who weren't locked into the "that's the way we've always done it" mode, and younger NCOs and smart, drafty troopers, whose minds and eyes were open when we had the annual firing battery tests at Camp Irwin. I basically went along for the ride. Herb Williams, Tony Escover radar warrant officer, Yoshio Murawa maintenance, and my great old top Master Sergeant Lee ran the whole drill. We'd come a long way. The boys worked in perfect harmony with one another, and their weapon systems as one by one C battery shot robot controlled Soviet intruder drones out of the sky, and we came home named the best firing battery in the brigade. It was not insignificant that Colonel Tyson did not write or call to say good job. His leadership skills wouldn't have coaxed the most eagerly lemming into the sea with all the good in my unit. C Battery still had its share of losers. One of these was Private Russell, whom I caught one night trying to slip through the barbed wire fence surrounding the battery. I was duty officer that evening and had just returned from my tennis shoe-clad silent sneak up on all the guards when I saw him in the motor pool with a blanket under his arm. "Where you going, young?" "Soldier," I asked. "I'm going to the beach with my girl. We're going to watch the star." "So are you now?" I replied. "I don't think you have a pass. Do you have a pass, Russell?" "No." "Right, and what's that I see under your arm? Looks like that blanket is government property. Government property cannot be taken off post, can it, Russell?" "No." "Okay. So why don't you just march your sweet ass back to your barracks before you find yourself in more trouble? You don't like me." He said the kid was absolutely right. I didn't like him at all. But it was only because I didn't like screw-ups. You've got the potential to be a damn good soldier, Russell. If you just get off your ass and get that big chip off your shoulder. "You think I have a chip on my shoulder," he retorted. "Well, why don't you try and knock it off? Might be just what you need. Might take off that jacket. He wanted us to be equals. Never wanted to let rank get in the way of a good lesson." I took off my jacket and fatigue cap and laid them on the hood of a parked jeep. I let Russell have the first swing, I blocked it, and let fly 4 punches that sent the private reeling to the ground. "Now pick yourself up and go to bed." I told him it was too dark to see the damage as he staggered to his feet and shagged ass to his billet. A little NCO, justice never hurt anyone. No thought. As I watched him go, more than once I'd had my clock cleaned by Jesse O'Giddens, my platoon sergeant in the tank company in Italy, as far as I was concerned. Getting the smartass knocked out of you was part of growing up, so didn't give the incident another thought as I cleaned my bleeding knuckles and hit the sack the next morning when we moved out for our daily run. Russell was not with his platoon. Suddenly the little incident of the night before took on awesome dimensions NCO. Justice was one thing, but I was a captain, and the kid co in my mind's eye. I saw the private standing with a bashed-up face in front of Colonel Thon's desk, while the good colonel rubbed his hands together with evil glee and plotted the most horrible way to relieve me. I worried throughout the run, normal rostered KP. From my first day with the unit, I'd organised George Clark to have a big stainless steel pot of orange juice ready for the boys when they returned from their run this morning. When we got back, who should be ladling out the juice but my midnight foe, Private Russell, sporting 2 black eyes, a split lip and a slightly battered nose. "Good morning, Russell," I said. "What happened to you? Fell down, sir, last night in the motor pool. You okay?" "Just fine, sir." And that was it. Word never got to the colonel, and Russell and I never spoke of it again. The job of duty officer was rostered, and a week or so later, when I was pulling it again, a young soldier with a strange old man's face told me with drafty directness that I should learn to be more tolerant. I told him I'd think about it and dashed back to the orderly room to look up the word in the dictionary upon consideration. The boy was right. So the following week I practiced tolerance, but I wasn't very good at it. So I decided to give it up. Even so, it had been a good week, because during this broad-minded phase I decided to try to straighten out another wise-ass draft. Soldier Gary Weinstein from New York City Weinstein, who had a master's or a PhD from some hotshot Eastern university, hated the army. His dress and manner bordered on insubordination from the moment he woke up until the moment he went to bed. His attitude was not uncommon among the drafty EM of the 50s during its boom years. Had got all the brains the army could commandeer, and guys like Weinstein often worked overtime to logically and articulately incite riot among their less educated peers. In Weinstein's case, I decided to use his quick tongue and brilliant mind to my advantage. Was always sending down we of the white hats anti-communist propaganda and other guidance to be served up to the troops. Even though Weinstein was an ball private in the radar section, I made him Troop Information NCO, responsible for getting the word out through weekly troop info lectures. It was the perfect job for him. He jazzed up the talks a bit. The other troopers loved listening to him, and almost before I knew it, this sad sack M became the sharpest soldier, not just of C Battery, but of the entire 47th Brigade, winning the highest honour of Brigade Soldier of the Year. Weinstein was so proud of that one, and so was I, that he gave me an autographed photo of Brigade C.G. Willis Perry, presenting him with the award I'd been wearing my soldier suit again for almost 9 months. Now it had taken about 3 to get the battery into shape. Since then, I'd been bored and increasingly restless. I submitted numerous applications to go to the newly forming Special Forces, but was again and again rejected on the grounds that the unit did not require AD officers at this time. My protests that I was not an AD officer fell on deaf ears. The establishment of Special Forces seemed to be the new looks-only concession to an army growing increasingly automatic talk within the military, and without was of push-button warfare a concept that would make ground forces more or less redundant. I found the whole idea difficult to believe, much less accept to begin with an army with no reliance on the soldier could hardly call itself an army, and though I was as enthusiastic as the next guy for the bigger bang for the buck weapon systems under development in 1956, it seemed to me that except in the event of all-out war with the Soviet Union, the new gear would be as appropriate as using a sledgehammer to swat at flies. When I first arrived in Italy in 1946, I couldn't understand why the one-man guard box at our camp at Cormans was exceptionally thick-walled, solid concrete, but I'd gotten the picture pretty damn quick when one day I found myself sharing the thing with Jimmy Sparks, both of us shaking in our boots as sniper fire, which moments before had caught us in the open, zinged and thudded against the sides of the box. Only a couple of 100 yards from our tank gate, a hidden communist Yugoslav partisan was making his presence known, but no one could ever get at him every time we tried the jug, and his weapon would simply disappear. It had been my first introduction to guerrilla warfare, and as time passed in Italy during those initial Cold War years, again and again, I saw examples of insurgent war on the chap. When they could get the explosives, the jugs would mine the road. The first Kia I ever saw were an American captain and his driver both killed when their jeep hit a mine. Strangely at the time, what had struck me even more than the dead men was the blanket of $20 MPCs that covered the ground all around them. The captain had been an 88th Division pay officer when the jugs couldn't get the big stuff. They just tied piano wire across the road between two trees at about jeep windshield level. Then they'd go away, leaving the Americans to lop their own heads off when they came barreling through the invisible wire windshields down at 40 or 50 miles per hour. Once on patrol, someone on the lead vehicle had seen strands of piano wire stretched across the ground immediately. The entire column stopped, and while we spent the next hour probing for mines in my mind's eye, I saw a little jug laughing in the woods at how he single-handedly had held up a whole Yankee armored recon company, new nuclear weapons with Eisenhower's threat of massive retaliation. If the Kremlin made a move had not stopped war, they had only changed its face. Though Hiroshima and Nagasaki had marked the end of World War II-style unconditional victories and the advent of Korea-style no-win conflicts in the 10 years since VJ Day, there had been dozens of decisive wars, not the least of which was the Chinese Revolution under Mao, where from a tiny band of insurgents came the overthrow of a government set in ground-it guerrilla war, not push-button. War was the wave of the future. It could only flourish under the protection of the bomb, and it was my kind of war, because it was the kind that a man, not a missile, had to fight to win. I spent those restless months in the 77th studying everything I could on the subject of guerrilla warfare, the colony's Indian-style tactics in response to the French and then the British, prior to and during America's Revolutionary War, the Filipino tactics after the Spanish-American conflict, which had young Lieutenant Douglas MacArthur inches from buying the farm, when a Filipino guerrilla sniper shot his hat right off his head, the Soviet, French-American and Yugoslav guerrilla activity during World War II, the British struggle in Malaya, and most recently the humiliating French defeat in Indochina. And I watched with particular interest the ongoing activities of a young Cuban stud named Castro, who was beginning to nickel and dime that tyrant Batista to death. More power to him. I thought in the meantime life at Sea Battery went on uneventfully until the morning one of my soldiers fell out on the beach with a collapsed lung as the colonel's phone ran hot with beachfront property owners complaining that their breakfast had been disturbed yet again by that maniac me. I put in my application to be relieved from active duty. Colonel Thyssen now had his reason to can me, and through Milo Rowell word came down in a big hurry that was just what he intended to do. The rumour was I was to be transferred to battalion staff as S2 to my mine-selling insurance was preferable to being the intelligence officer in the AD battalion in Manhattan Beach, California, especially when the reassignment was in fact punishment for just doing my job training, had always been the bane of all the armed services after World War II. It went soft, well attested to by the horrific casualties in the early days of Korea. The American people were shocked. How could the government have allowed their sons to go off to war, so ill-prepared those of us who'd been trained well and fought through those bleak days wondered the same thing those who survived to become training madmen in Korea carried the same passion into their subsequent commands. There we were thwarted before we'd hardly begun, with neither the means nor the blessings of the powers that be. Apparently there was no room for training. Madmen in this peacetime army. Ike's budget cuts were the first obstacle toward maintaining a combat-ready Army ground force gasoline, live ammo, and adequate training facilities. All cost money. Ike's austerity kick gave us barely enough dough to conduct morning PT. Then there was the draft, which brought into the Army not just uneducated kids from the wrong side of the tracks, but university graduates with minds of their own. Many were pampered punks for whom a drill sergeant had two choices: either spoon-feed them into acquiescence or ramp-rod them into submission. Most good sergeants chose the firm but fair latter course. The Army was never meant to be a democratic organisation on the battlefield. There's no time to say please or to take a vote on who's going to knock out a machine gun. The fact is, a soldier's response must be automatic and based in a philosophy about killing that simply cannot be taught in a classroom: kill or be killed. Hands-on training in the control of a seasoned hard-ass NCO can often mean that the difference between life and death for a boy on the battlefield. Take the case of Willie Lump Lump, whose tragic story, well known among my men, went something like this. After World War II, a boy named Willie Lump Lump enlisted in the Army. He went to Fort Benning to take his infantry training, 16 weeks of sweat and tears and lots of punishment, to turn him into a hardened soldier. Along about the 7th week of training, a sergeant stood up in front of his class and said, "Gentlemen, I'm Sergeant Slasher, and today I'm going to introduce you to the bayonet on guard." With that, the sergeant went into the correct stance for holding the bayonet on the battlefield. He continued, "You will meet the enemy, and there will be times when you will need this bayonet to defeat the enemy, to kill the enemy. Over the next weeks, you'll be receiving a 20-hour block of instruction on the bayonet, and I will be your principal instructor. Willie Lump." Lump went back to the barracks, deeply upset man that was so brutal out there today. He thought the war is over, we're living in peace and tranquility, and still the Army is teaching us how to use these horrible weapons, dear Mum. He wrote home today. The sergeant told me he's going to teach me how to use the bayonet to kill enemy soldiers on the battlefield. Willie's mother was shocked. She got right on the phone. "Hello, Congressman Dog. Good, this is Mrs. Lump Lump. I want to tell you what's happening down at Fort Benning, Georgia. Here it is 1949, and they're teaching my baby to kill with a bayonet. It's uncivilized. It's barbaric." The congressman immediately got on the horn. "Hello, General. Play it right at the Pentagon. This is Congressman Do Good. I understand the Army is still giving bayonet training. Yes, we are. Do you think it's a good idea? I don't think it's a very good thing at all. It's even somewhat uncivilized. I mean, really, how many times does a soldier need his bayonet?" "Not very often, sir. It's true. Actually, I was just reviewing the Army training program myself, and I was thinking that the bayonet is a pretty obsolete weapon. I agree with you. I'll put out instructions that it's going to stop the next day, 700 miles away. Gentlemen, I am Sergeant Slasher. This is your second class on bayonet training." The sergeant was interrupted by a lieutenant walking purposefully toward him across the training field. "Stand. Easy, men, it's out," the lieutenant whispered. "What?" said the sergeant. "It's out," the lieutenant whispered again. The sergeant nodded, his mouth wide open in disbelief. He returned to his class. "Gentlemen, we'll have to break here. It looks as if bayonet training has been discontinued in the Army a year later." PFC Lump Lump, the model soldier deployed to Korea with the 1st Battalion 15th Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, he was standing on a frozen hill, and the Chinese were coming at him, wave after wave after wave. Willie stood like a rock. Resolutely he shot the enemy down. Suddenly he realized he was out of ammunition. He looked at his belt, not a round left. He saw a rushing toward him. He remembered the first class on bayonet training. He reached down and pulled his bayonet out of his scabbard. Shaking and fumbling, he tried to fit it on the end of his weapon. But by that time the Chinese soldier was standing over him with a bayonet of his own. The Secretary of the Army signed it, his 1000th letter for the day. "Dear Mrs. Lump, Lump, It is with deep regret that I must inform you that your son, PFC Willie Lump Lump, was killed in action the 27th of November 1950. Heartbroken, Mrs. Lump Lump wrote to some friends of young Willie's in the company how she asked why Willie wasn't trained. They wrote back, he didn't know how to use his bayonet. Now Mrs. Lump Lump was not only heartbroken but outraged. She didn't even bother to call Congressman Do Good. She barged right into his office, why she cried and screamed. Why wasn't my son trained for war, the mythical wily Lump? Lump was my training aide. I used him in every unit I commanded to explain two things to the troops. First, that the training they were about to receive was in their best interests, and second, that the civilian population didn't know diddly squad about the realities of war, because as much as any other factor civilian interference was what was leading the post-career Army training program down the tubes a few months before my trooper fell out on the beach. There had been an incident at the Paris Island Marine Corps Training Centre. A drill sergeant named McKen had gotten his 74-man platoon of recruits out of bed for a night march, in order, he said, to teach them discipline. The end result was 6 dead boots swept down a fast-running creek on the island. McKen was court-martialed, and the entire military training system went on trial by the press. Heads rolled on Paris Island as bleeding heart civilians got on their soapboxes and called for an end, essentially, to any training that carried with it even the slightest risk of danger. The military overreacted when Paris Island CG was transferred out of his command. A chill went down the spines of all the new-style self-serving commanders I'd met in, and since my second tour in Korea, who put their careers above their missions and their men, but for the grace of God, they thought and gratefully accepted the new training safety regulations sent down from the top. It was a long, long way from Blue Devil Day in Geria, Italy, the one day each month, when all units in the 88th Blue Devil Division were put through their paces. At one of these, I'd been going through the bayonet training drill and managed to vertical butt-stroke my squad leader, who was dancing in front of me, daring me to get him right in the chops with my M1 rifle. My regimental commander, Colonel Ball, who'd strolled by just as the sergeant fell to the ground in a shower of blood and teeth, hadn't even flinched. Good work. Soldier, he'd said, speaking from the experience of 3 years of the toughest combat of World War II in Africa, Sicily and Italy. Good training, the only way to prepare men for combat, is to train them in conditions as close to the real thing as possible. A CO has to be prepared to take his lumps in training. Soldiers cannot be trained in a classroom, then be thrown onto a battlefield and be expected to cope in fighter company. I'd taken my share of wounded in our company in the attack demonstrations, guys hit by shrapnel from a shell landing a little too close in, but I'd been willing to take that risk because I wanted those people to know what it was like to have a mortar round slam down in front of them and hear machine gun slugs snap over their heads. The average 2% training casualties we had, to my mind, were a small premium for an insurance policy that could cover a whole unit. When the real shooting started, the McKeon case was just a terrible tragedy. The sergeant was charged with 6 counts of involuntary manslaughter oppression of recruits and drinking on duty with the help of powerful testimony from the greatest Marine of them all. Lieutenant General Lewis, B. Chesty Puller McKeon, was eventually acquitted of the manslaughter and oppression of recruits charges, but the verdict did not calm the fluttering hearts of Colonel Thyssen, and his ilk and peacetime army training continued its downhill spiral, the horrible consequence of which would not be seen for another decade, as just one company commander in the next war would say, "We got kids in combat." Who believed that people were just shooting blanks at them? They really believed they couldn't die out there. The 47th Brigade EXO. Colonel William Shanahan persuaded me not to quit the army over Colonel Thyssen. He told me a new unit, the 108th Arty Group, had recently been formed to control the 4 Nike Ajax missile battalions being deployed around Los Angeles. If I wanted a new job, he said he could organize me to be Group Logistics Officer. I jumped at the offer before it was halfway out of the colonel's mouth. My primary mission in the new assignment was to coordinate all missile site construction with the Army's Los Angeles-based district engineers. I also handled special logistic work, mostly written studies on everything from relocation of established facilities to reports on moisture content in missile storage areas, and what corrective action might be taken based at Fort MacArthur, I was most fortunate to have as a boss Major Edward McKinnon, an old soldier and a damn good man major. Mac was a joy to work for. He played the role of teacher in the early days of my first staff job, patiently rewriting my papers with me by his side until I got the hang of it. Senior Clerk Master Sergeant James Cook saved my arse on more than one occasion too, as he helped me appreciate the maze of jargon that characterized all Army correspondence as well, because the job required considerable travelling. I was authorised both an Army sedan and a driver your logistics clerk, of my choice the first time I saw Private Tom Martin. He was mowing the lawn in front of Group HQ without a doubt. He was the sloppiest American soldier I'd ever seen in my Army career. His fatigue cap was kind of hanging off the back of his head. His fatigue uniform was so wrinkled that there was no doubt in my military mind that he slept in it. His boots weren't shined, his trousers weren't bloused. His hair badly needed a cut, and big clumps of stubble darkened his extraordinarily poorly shaved face. The term sad sack took on new meaning for me. I went over to him to deliver little on-the-spot correction. To my great surprise, he obligingly got himself together, and as we talked I realised this sad sack was one very smart guy, a new replacement trained in high-speed telegraph. Martin was still waiting assignment when he said he could drive type, and had 13 years of Jesuit schooling. That was all I needed to know. I went to Captain Johnson, the Group HQ battery commander, to organise the private as my clerk share assistant. Johnson thought I was crazy. Have you seen him? He's a disgrace to the uniform. The captain went on to tell me that Tom was a smart-ass college draft whom nobody wanted, and whom he felt sure he'd end up kicking out of the army. I insisted, saying that I thought the boy had a lot of potential, and I'd really like the challenge of shaping him up. Finally, with great reluctance, Johnson assigned Tom to Group S4. Tom got to work on time the first day, but that was about all that could be said in his favour. He hadn't shined his shoes, he'd painted them. His brass was positively green, his khaki uniform looked even worse than his baggy fatigues, and he was wearing white socks. I knew in an instant that the guy wasn't going to change, and that the hardest part of my job would be just keeping him out of Captain Johnson's sight, so I became Tom's protector. And at the same time he became mine, taught him how to shine. His brass badgered him to keep his uniform neat and tidy, and made sure he and Johnson's paths never crossed in return. He wrote the staff studies each evening. We'd come back from our little sojourns in the field and talk through the problem. I'd provide the guidance from a military standpoint, and Tom would take my views and work them into a knockout of a paper from the first one we submitted. The kudos kept on coming with Tom at the wheel of our Army sedan. The two of us drove around Los Angeles virtually every day doing our logistics thing. It was good duty. We usually finished the work by noon, and because my secondary self-assigned mission was to keep Tom as far from HQ and Captain Johnson as possible, I felt totally justified in taking the afternoons off and not bringing him home until dark. The job was great for Tom, too. After all those years in the seminary, he'd quit just a couple weeks before he was to take the priestly plunge. Now he was like a kid playing hooky from school. He was brilliant at playing the horses. The Jesuits had sharpened his keen mathematical mind to a razor's edge, and we spent as much time at Hollywood Park as we did at our job in the line of duty. We'd often go out for lunch too, and took great pleasure in destroying the complacency of Southern California suburbia one afternoon. For example, we were sitting at an outdoor restaurant near Hollywood. The waiter was hovering anxiously nearby, probably because we were in uniform and carrying rolled-up blueprints and building plans. So in a low voice, just loud enough for his benefit, I said, "You know, Tom, I really think that real estate across the street would be perfect for a missile site. The real estate in question was like Saks Fifth Avenue." Tom immediately picked up his cue. "I've just been thinking the same thing, sir, and we could put the acquisition radar on that little hill over there. It wouldn't be too tough to move Griffith Observatory, would it?" "Sir, no sweat," I replied. "This is military priority. We're talking about the defence of the nation." The waiter's eyes bulged out of his head. Tom and I often wondered how far or how fast the land prices in that neighbourhood came tumbling down after the whisper got going that the military was about to condemn it all and take it over. Another day, we just picked up some stuff downtown at the LT District Engineers, and decided to go to the Hilton for lunch. As we walked into the lobby, Tom suddenly stopped and dramatically unrolled a blueprint he was carrying. Now I was the one to pick up the cue. I looked from the blueprint to the hotel lobby. Yes, I think this will be fine. We'll just cordon off this area here, shut down all the elevators except this one here. Of course, we'll need security on top. Meanwhile, Tom had whipped out his pad and was taking notes. The assistant manager came bustling up. "May I help you, gentlemen?" He'd caught me off guard. I put on my most official voice. "Haven't you been informed?" "No, sir, I haven't." "Well, I don't have the security clearance to tell you myself, but you will be informed the Chief of Staff of the Army should be ringing any minute to tell you who'll be coming." I tried to make the mysterious VIP sound like God. The assistant manager hurried off just before he got out of earshot. I turned back to Tom. "We'll have to remove all that glass too in case someone decides to bomb the joint with that." We went into the dining room and within a few minutes the hotel manager came up to the table. "I understand you've been looking over the hotel. May I ask for what reason by this time both Tom and I realized we'd been guilty of overacting? We'd surreptitiously taken off our name tags the second we sat down to prevent our little joke from blowing up in our faces. Still, we were in too deep now not to play the drama out. I told the manager how sorry I was for the slip-up in communications, that I was not authorized to tell him why we were there, but the minute we got back to headquarters we'd advise the general, who would of course call him the manager, was really thrown as he walked away from the table. I felt kind of bad, but there wasn't anything I could do. Finally, we finished our meal and went to pay the bill. "Oh, no, sir," the cashier said, whisking away the check. "The manager said it's on the house compliments of the Hilton, and who said there's no such thing as a free lunch on one of the rare days I was working at my desk." A good-looking E4 walked into the office. At first I didn't recognize him. All I saw was a snazzy starched uniform, perfectly polished brass and shoes, a rigid attention and a brilliantly executed salute. Then I noticed the 77th Battalion crests on his epaulettes. It was ex-Private Russell, whom I decked in the 77th Motor Pool. He was at Fort Emper Centre being discharged. He come in to say goodbye and to thank me for kicking his ass. "I deserved it," he said. "And I kind of figured if you were willing to risk your career to make a soldier out of me, maybe I should give it a try. But you know something, Captain," he continued. "I could have nailed you. My uncle is Senator Richard Russell. And if he'd heard about that fight, and with that the nephew of the chairman of the all-powerful Senate Armed Services Committee, tossed me another great salute and marched out in style, and as everyone in the office commented on the fine-looking trooper and asked who he was, I quietly quaked in my boots and told them he was just one of my boys. A fine Georgia boy Russell's visit really moved me, but for a while afterward I wondered whether I'd have let him get on a first-name basis with my fists, if I'd known who he was. Chances were the answer was yes for two reasons. First, because you always go with what you know, and I knew the kid needed a little knuckle drill. And second, because as a rule I lived and worked by gut feeling in my gut. I knew Russell was a good man, just as gut feeling told me Tom Martin was a good man. If you went out on a limb for guys like that, they'd come through for you too, as Tom did one Saturday morning a couple of weeks later, when I overslept after a big poker game with some Woodbury College buddies. A big briefing had been planned for Brigade C.G. Perry and his staff, and at HUS-1 the briefer, was still in bed. I jumped up, shaved in 10 seconds flat, and raced down to Fort Mac at 100 miles per hour. I got there with about a minute to spare, only to find the charts already set up, and Tom Martin standing by, shined starched and spruced up, like a perfect trust trooper prepared, if necessary, to give the briefing himself. As it turned out, the general was delayed, so I had a chance to wash the blood off my face. But the point was, I'd never seen old sad sack Tom voluntarily get himself together before. But when I needed him most, he was there looking like Soldier of the Month. My roommate during this period was General Perry's aide Bill Coward. Bill was a stud of an officer, a lawyer from Florida who'd commanded a missile battery before moving up to brigade. We'd become friends when I was in the 77th when I moved. The same jobs, the losses were probably even more serious in the NCO Corps, where thousands of World War II and Korea vets, tough old squad leaders and platoon sergeants with 5 to 15 years' service were tossed out of the army during the RF simply for not meeting the army's arbitrary IQ scores. How much money was actually saved through the RF program would be hard to estimate, but if you stopped to consider the quality lost and the damage done to the army as an institution, it probably wasn't much for myself. I considered every day I remained a captain another day under damn's sword, especially after the ER Colonel Tyson rendered on me when I left C Battery. If that wasn't R material, I didn't know what was. It was so hot, in fact, that it burst into flames the minute it hit the office of brigade personnel. Luckily, I had a friend there who contained the damage, but he couldn't do anything to save that poor CHER, so it never found its way into my DR records, and I was safe at least for a while it was more likely General Cleland's influence than anything else that kept me from being rifed. The only preventive measure I took besides alerting the volunteer firemen at brigade was to enroll in night school to finish my Associate of Arts degree with Tom around to help write my term papers. It was pretty much a breeze, and the extra long days were well worth the effort if they'd keep me from being chucked out of the army before Gauze had a chance to become too sure of myself. Though a kick came in the form of Army Chief of Staff General Maxwell D. Taylor at a meeting of the LA Association of the U.S. Army. The general spoke passionately about the necessity for higher education among the officer corps. I'd already heard the drill about getting a master's, but now Taylor added his desire that all of us achieve fluency in not one but 2 other languages, and I had enough trouble with English. The new look had brought with it not only a new kind of weaponry, but a new kind of warrior as well. Actually, the new breed was kind of a warrior diplomat, as bloodless ballistics seemed to be phasing out the role of fighters on future battlegrounds. The emphasis increased on the diplomatic side of soldiering. The competition was fierce. You either learned to dance and prance and speak Chinese, or you sat back and waited for your RAF notice in the mail. Now it was not what you said or did that counted, but how, and old soldiers for whom diplomacy and tact were harder to master than jumping out of a plane or bandying a hill, were left shaking their heads like puzzled commuters staring at the schedule and wondering how they got on the wrong bus. The scenery was just so different, the most familiar, the most steeped in history. The most inspiring landmarks were, one by one being razed to the ground first to go, were the distinctly army brown shoes in the name of cost efficiency. The new look policy was that black shoes would be worn by all services. Next on the hit list was the square frame belt buckle. I found this one kind of strange, unlike the new standard to all services. Brass buckle, the old one could not only hold up your trousers, but also open a beer faster than a conventional bottle opener. It was hard to believe that old Army Ike would sanction our giving up such a versatile item for a junky 39-cent single-function variety, but he did again in the name of cost efficiency. Funnily, the belt buckles often separated the old warriors from the new diplomats. One glance around a room to see who was wearing what, because a lot of us refused to comply, was generally enough to pinpoint which army a guy was coming from. It might not have seemed like much in the end. What difference did black shoes or brass buckles really make? But the fact was, it made a lot of difference. An institution was an institution, and for the old guys who bed at the new, look, it wasn't a simple story of resisting change. Instead, it was an attempt to stave the flow of blood which was pumping hideously out of an increasingly ash in Army's veins. But then suddenly it was too late even for a tourniquet. Chief of Staff Taylor disbanded all the old Army regiments with all their history and tradition to make way for new-look battle groups, each composed of 5 rial companies. This battalion 5-sided system, designed for the nuclear battlefield, was fittingly called the Pentomic Army, and the front line was now the forward edge of the battle area FIBA. But the new lingo was more a public relations exercise than anything else. After all, a killing ground by any other name is still a killing ground. Within 5 years, the Pentomic concept would prove completely unworkable, and the army would furtively reorganize once again. But the damage done in the meantime was, in a word, irreparable. One more of the last vestiges of the old army disappeared when we traded in our familiar OD uniforms for new forest green ones modelled before Congress. by none other than Captain Joe Love, that fine soldier I'd met in Korea when we relieved his unit at the Gap. The new gear was a close copy of the German Vermont uniform of World War II, from the Prussian-style billed service cap to the heels of the coal-black shoes. The German look didn't bother me much, no question, but the Germans were brilliant in all things military, even if they didn't win many wars. And in the years following World War II, all kinds of German designs went on permanent loan to the US Army. The M60 machine gun bore a striking resemblance in function to the German MG-34. Our self-propelled anti-tank weapon spat was much like the famed Kraut 88mm, except that ours, like the new belt buckle, was on the cheap tinny side and was down with maintenance problems. Most of the time, the missile program was in the hands of former Nazi scientists who'd surrendered to the Americans at war's end, led by Werner von Braun, developer of the space-age ISTIC V2. Somebody up there was definitely fascinated with the German war machine. It seemed to me we copied virtually everything the Germans had to offer, except their leadership and discipline techniques. We would have done well to examine this aspect of German might too, as in fact it accounted for much of their military strength. Instead, the army dealt a thoughtless blow to the very foundation of leadership by instituting yet another new look policy name tags to be sewed onto all fatigues and personalized badges, the name in white on black plastic, like the ones Tom and I deep-sixed at the Hilton to be pinned on all dress uniforms. The philosophy behind those name tags was as transparent as cellophane, and about as flimsy to me. Their advent was a sure sign that US Army leadership was on a downhill slide. Napoleon was said to have been able to recall 50,000 of his soldiers by name in the new army. A CO didn't even have to learn 5. Yet, no, your men was a crucial principle of leadership, and that meant not just their names, but where they were from. What they thought, what made them tick name tags, were all very well for the new-style officer who stayed in a peacetime command only long enough to jockey his way into a better career-furthering slot. Why bother memorizing names, went his thinking he'd never use again. But for the trooper, personalized uniforms were just another gimmicky example of an increasingly impersonal, almost corporate army one difficult alt to love, let alone have the allegiance to, that would serve him and the country well in the event of war.